The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, has warned that hot water has become a health risk for many nations. Hot weather, rather. News data released by UNICEF shows that almost every child on Earth will be affected by heat waves by 2050. In the report, the UN agency said that already around 559 million children are exposed to high heat wave frequency, and around 624 million children are exposed to one of three other high heat measures. UNICEF is forecasting that over 2 billion children will face more frequent heat waves, regardless of whether the world achieves a low greenhouse gas emission scenario or not. According to UNICEF, nearly half of all children in Africa and Asia will face sustained exposure to extreme high temperatures by 2050. And for more on this, we're joined by Lars Bernd, Regional Resilience Advisor for UNICEF West and Central Africa. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Perhaps let's just first start by understanding what we mean by high temperatures, because it's all relative, isn't it, depending on where you are and what you're used to. So when you say, just in terms of children are already facing high heat wave conditions, if we're speaking about the continent, what degrees Celsius are we talking about, the average that they're experiencing? And if we're forecasting to 2050, what are the temperatures that it's likely to rise to?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to present our report. Indeed, what we are saying in this report is that at the moment already 1 in 3 kids in Africa and approximately 40% of children in Asia experience already more than 84 days a year over 35 degrees Celsius. So this is like kind of a threshold we set. And the alarming news we bring in our forecast in the report is that by 2015, actually this number is likely to rise to nearly half of the children in both regions affected by these dramatic temperatures of over 35 degrees during 84 days.
Okay, you can continue.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to mention the countries, of course, it is for Africa, it is mainly the Sahel. So we're talking mainly about Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Niger, these countries, Sudan, which are most exposed. But I think also in Southern Africa, you have had your heat waves. So it's almost the whole continent somehow which will be affected, yeah.
So the health risks that you talk about as a result of hot weather, what are you seeing, and is it specific to these countries, the type of illnesses that you're focusing on or experiencing?
Well, what we must remember is, first of all, because this focus is, of course, on children. I mean, it comes from UNICEF. It is also very particular reason because children will actually experience these heat waves in a much harsher way than adults. I mean, they're less able to regulate their body temperature compared to adults. And that means that the more they're exposed to heat waves, the greater they have chances of health problems. And these include, of course, a whole set of problems. I mean, there are certainly chronic respiratory conditions, asthma, cardiovascular diseases. And of course, babies and young children will be mostly impacted by heat-related mortality. But also, what we don't have to neglect is that there's also the children's environment which will be impacted. So it's not only about the health issue itself, but it's also about safety. It's about nutrition. It's about access to water and learning outcomes, education, and future livelihoods. For example, if there's no water, I mean, there will be certainly an impact on the use of toilets or latrines, especially in impoverished communities. There will be less used. The use will be dwindled without water, and there will be increased risk of infection, diarrhea. But also we will have more skin diseases, urinary tract infection, waterborne disease spreading. So there's a whole set beyond the direct health impact due to the heat wave, which will be actually compounded by these trends we are observing.
Obviously, some communities are more adept at living in certain conditions than others, but you're saying in the current context of climate change, the conditions obviously are becoming unbearable, and I'm thinking about IDPs or even, migrants from the various borders of the African continent, that they'd probably be more severely exposed. So what can be done? What kind of resources can be mobilized in conditions of lack?
No, thank you very much. I mean, you really put the finger where it hurts. I mean, indeed, this will change considerably the way our communities are actually functioning in Africa, the migration patterns, the displacement, but also in effect then the children's schooling and health. I mean, I'm based at the moment in Dakar, in Senegal, where I observe very much the Sahel, and we are observing already, of course, a lot of changes in the usual migration patterns. I mean, the transhumance patterns. I mean, of basically herders moving down their cattle. I mean, they are already affected by climate change. And of course, I mean, if these things continue this way, it will be whole communities actually moving further south. And this will also have an impact basically on conflict, I mean, which needs to be handled. So it is a whole set of compounded risk actually we are talking about. And also, I mean, it is basically that we are reaching temperature levels where we can say that it will be very difficult for the human body to tolerate these temperatures, and particularly for children. So, yeah, there's a lot to come, and it needs certainly a multi-sectoral response. We certainly have to help communities and nations to adapt the infrastructure and services to make them climate resilient. And this is, of course, for health, but also for water, for nutrition, education. And then hopefully we can make these communities still thrive and develop.
So if you were to speak to leaders at the COP summit in Egypt next month, what would you say in terms of, I mean, we've already seen that the UN has continually lamented the demise of politicians, governments not keeping their promises, not only on carbon emissions, but we're already in danger of keeping to the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So what would you say to them, not only about mobilizing resources, but prioritizing children?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is absolutely important. But basically, I mean, when we talk about climate finance, you mentioned, I mean, there were commitments made at the last COP in Glasgow. I mean, to basically move to double basically the adaptation funding to $30 billion per year by 2025. And also by 2030 to reach at least $300 billion per year. So these commitments, of course, need still to be requested for. I mean, countries are accountable for that, so we have to continue with this, but also we have to basically ensure that funding is, I mean, while continuing, of course, to serve to reduce emissions, basically for climate change mitigation, also to move increasingly to adaptation, because communities are suffering already from climate change. And in this regard, this report particularly highlights, as I mentioned in the beginning, the particular vulnerability of children in several sectors, that we really ensure that, I mean, basically the rights of the children in a climate crisis will be prioritized on adaptation. I mean, in UNICEF, we very much purport this so-called life cycle approach. Basically, a child for us is between conception and 18 years. And you will agree with me that the vulnerability of a toddler or a 16-year-old girl or an adult male will be different in terms of the climate crisis and related disasters. So we really have to make people understand and also call for real an implication. I mean, basically, an opening up that the commitments, which are also earlier built for basically youth capacity to be part of decision making, will be further strengthened. There are some initiatives for this. There's something called ACE, Action Plan, Action for Climate Empowerment. And so this is one of the key asks of UNICEF, certainly at the COP27.
Before we run out of time,
these rights of children will be prioritized.
I need to ask this, not to be alarmist, but the reality of this situation. If we don't prepare for a climate change world for children, this will happen. How do you answer that question?
Well, I mean, what we must take note of is that usually, I mean, in society in Africa or in other places, I mean, children make up 50%, sometimes 60%. This is the future, basically. It's a future generation, the children. I mean, this is nothing new. But, I mean, if we don't address their needs now, I mean, first of all, of course, there's a direct impact on them, on their on their growth, on their upbringing. I mean, in terms of their direct health. I mean, they might just not develop properly because, of course, the child, I mean, especially young children under 5, if they don't get proper nutrition, proper health services, but also education, they will never be able to develop and thrive normally. So this is a huge how to say, Damocles sword on our head. If we don't provide these services, we will have problems for our children and for future generations. Now, of course, if we don't provide opportunities as well for these children, I mean, to engage and to find the solutions and to sensitize them and also make their voices heard, we will lose them on the way. We have to make this shift together. We cannot focus on adults only. We have to use, let's say, quote unquote, we have to work with the children who are very dynamic, with young people already engaging, and it would like to contribute to this debate and to these solutions, basically, to provide a brighter, which means a climate resilient world.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Much appreciated. And that is UNICEF's Lars Bernd sounding a warning that children are being exposed to extreme heat waves, and as a result, we are going to lose this